Hello, Lappers. Welcome to another interactive week of preschool project. I'm so excited about this week. I think last week went pretty well. I heard your feedback and I'm ready to talk about reading, writing, and implementing goals a little bit deeper than last semester. So let's go ahead and get started. So just a brief review, like we talked about last semester, goals have specific things included in them. So there's a couple different things that every goal needs to have. The first one is the date by which the goal will be completed. The second one is, of course, the name of the client. The third one is what task the client needs to do. The fourth one is under what circumstances must the client perform the task. The fifth one is what cues and prompts does the client get? That includes both the type and number. And the sixth one is what does the client have to do in order to reach the goal? So that includes the percentage accuracy over how many sessions and what counts as data. What I mean by that, if you don't remember from last semester, is typically at the end of a goal, it'll be written like over 2 or 3 consecutive sessions, meaning that if they hit the goal one time and then another time, but then not the third time, they don't meet the goal and they have to start over again. They have to get it 3 times in a row in order to be released from therapy. What counts as data? Usually there will be a blurb at the end that says as measured by clinician data or as measured by SLP data and notes. But it also could include things like as measured by teacher report or as measured by parent survey. So typically it'll be SLP data or notes, but it also could include other things as well, just depending on what the goal is and what the background of the child is. So when you read and write goals, every single time you get a new student on your caseload, you're going to have to read their old goals, right? Because if I get a brand new kid, I don't know who they are, I don't know their background, I don't know what they've been working on, what their progress is. And so the best way that you can get a picture of what you're going to be doing with them is by looking at their goals, looking at their long-term goal, looking at the short-term goals, so that when you start working with them, you can kind of test and see, hey, are they at this level? And if the child is old enough, like a middle schooler or high schooler, you can get some more insight into what they've been working on by just asking them. Obviously, if they're younger, like preschool or early elementary, they're not going to have as strong of an understanding as the older kids are. You're also going to have to read and write goals every time that you assess a student, right? So every time you assess a student for the first time, you're going to have to write them a goal. Unless you elect to not provide services, which we talked about a little bit last week. The girl who had to like organize all the things into categories, she would not qualify for services because she was performing at 100% accuracy on all of the measures. So you would not write her a goal. But for the other child who was, you know, trying to identify the things inside the little eggs, you would have to write them a goal and you want to make sure it's an appropriate goal. Every year, students get a new goal for their services as well. So you're going to have to write a goal every time you assess, but then also once a year, once they're on your caseload. And when you're doing this, you're not only having to read and write your own goals and their previous goals, but also the goals written by other service providers. So if they're working with special education, OT, PT, psych, teachers, whoever you're working with, they're going to write their own goals as well. And you have to be able to understand what else they're working on, because a lot of the times it benefits the child to kind of have this collaboration, which we're going to talk about later in the semester of how to successfully do that. And I can't even describe to you how beneficial it is to be able to read a goal from somebody in occupational therapy and say, okay, I know exactly what that is. Or if you don't know all the terminology, being able to say, okay, well, I understand they're working on this and this and this, but I don't understand this part. And it kind of just helps the occupational therapist know that you are competent, that you're willing to learn and work with them, which causes a really positive workplace environment. So yes, you also will personally have to write a new goal every year. So lots of practice there. Also, every 3 years, once the child has services, or maybe even more frequently if the parent requests it, the child is going to get a whole new assessment and all new goals. And so every 3 years, you're going to have to evaluate their previous goals and do a new assessment and see if they're still at the level that you think they are. And so again, you're going to have to be reading and writing goals all the time. And finally, every few months, especially like at winter break and summer break, you're going to have to provide a progress summary on all of the students' goals and how they're doing. So it's a very critical skill if you're going to be working in any sector of special education. In the school system, to know how to read and write goals, but also in the hospitals and in pretty much every aspect of healthcare. This is something that you're going to have to know how to do and learn how to do well. So once you write the goal or read the goal, how do you decide what to target? And I feel like this is something that I struggled with at first. I could read the goal and I could say, theoretically, I know that they're supposed to be working on this, but how do I decide that? Or even here, writing the goal. How do you decide how to even write the goal? What do you decide to even write it about? The first thing that I tend to do is look at the milestones. So, especially with the younger kids, this is a really great tool to kind of know where they're supposed to be in comparison to their peers. Also, when you're giving a standardized test, you're going to get a score that'll tell you exactly what you need to know. So for example, if you give the PLS, it'll give you that bell curve. We talked about that a little bit last week. And if the child is performing below a certain point, you're going to say, okay, they do need services. And it'll tell you what they did poorly on, what they did well on. And so you'll be able to kind of look at that test and be like, okay, they understood everything I told them. They followed all my directions, but they just weren't saying anything. So in that case, you're going to work on their expressive language, not their receptive language, because they're already understanding you fine. But that's still important information because you know that that's a strength of theirs, that they can understand you, and you can dive into that receptive language in order to boost their expressive language, right? You use the strengths to boost up the weaknesses. Again, using any other assessment measure, you're going to need to pull up milestones to know how the child is performing. And there's milestones for everything, for physical activity, for speech, language, cognition, play, even. There's milestones that children meet. And I will share a pretty comprehensive milestone chart that I have that I use all the time. And it is so helpful. I got it straight from Ash's website, and it gives lots of really great information for where a child should be with speech and language goals. And I will also share a document that I got from Dr. Abel that has a lot of different play goals and milestones that I had never even considered before. So those are really helpful tools to get you started. So now let's walk through reading and writing goals together. As promised last week, I'm going to walk through a couple of my different clients that I've actually had in the past 3 years. I'm not going to reveal their exact ages, names, or where I treated them because I treated both in California and Indiana. And I'm also not going to reveal what year I treated them just to maintain their privacy and confidentiality. So let's walk through one of my clients. We talked about her a little bit last week. She's really fun, really great, super hard worker. I'll read this little blurb I wrote up. So she was a 4-year-old girl who was very hard to understand, low intelligibility. She had many phonological patterns, including final consonant deletion, backing, cluster reduction, various substitutions, distortions, and omissions. So a lot going on. At her age, cluster reduction and some of her articulation errors are normal, but final consonant deletion, backing, and some of her articulation errors were abnormal. Now, the first little part of that blurb, so her phonological patterns, I got that information through assessment, right? I gave her a couple different tests. We took a language and speech sample. I gave her the HAP3 and the GIFTA combined with the Con-Lewis. So those are different articulation and phonology standardized assessments. And so through those tests, we identified her areas of strength, her areas of weakness, and that will tell you her score. So she was very low on the bell curve. But then this next sentence is saying, at her age, this and this and this is normal, this and this and this is not. I know that information because I know the milestones, right? And so you're always going to want to refer back to those milestones and say, okay, is this something that is a normal error? For example, she's 4 years old. That means that if she's pronouncing R as W, which she was, that's normal. A lot of 4-year-olds do that. And so that's not something that we would typically treat in speech for a preschooler. And so that's what I meant here in this sentence of, cluster reduction, and some of her articulation errors are normal. They're nothing to be concerned about, but she did have a few things that were abnormal for her age. And because she was typically developing, those were things that we wanted to treat. So I'm starting off with a speech goal, but I just want to reiterate that at Rosa Parks, we do not focus on speech. We focus on language. It's more important what the child is saying versus how they're saying it. And typically, you won't start treating articulation until later, like in elementary school. But I just wanted to throw this in here because I think sometimes it's easier to understand speech goals because they're more black and white than language, I feel personally. And I think that my brain works better when I start off with something I understand and then go to something a little bit more abstract. So when you're treating speech goals, as I'm sure you've learned in a couple of your classes already, there's a couple of different ways you can do it, right? So you can either use a developmental approach, which is where you kind of target things in the order that they're supposed to develop, and you treat each sound and error separately. You could use a cyclical approach, which is where you choose a couple different sounds and you do one and then another and then another, and there's like a set schedule to when you do each. Or you could use the complexity theory, which through my personal experience with not only this client, but a couple of other ones, this one is a great example of complexity theory. If you target a complex sound, it's going to generalize to lots of other sounds. So also if you target at a more salient sound, it's going to generalize. So it's a really great thing to use when you have a client with a lot of errors, because you just have to target one or two things and then it's going to fix like 12 things. Which is so helpful because instead of having to treat each of those 12 things individually, you just have to treat two and you get the same progress, but a lot faster. And this child is a huge, great example of this. She is grown up now, but at the beginning, she was very hard to hear. And at the end, she was completely intelligible by the time she was discharged from therapy. So based off of these, going back a little bit, based off of these phonological patterns and the milestones, what did I decide to target? So of course, as you guys can tell, I decided to lean in a little bit on the complexity theory, but I also decided to target final consonant deletion. The reason why I decided to target this is because it is supposed to have been suppressed before age 4, so she wasn't supposed to be doing it anymore. And it was greatly impacting her intelligibility. This child would not pronounce the last sound of any word she said. And so imagine if you only heard half of each word somebody was saying, it's very hard to understand them, especially when combined with all of these other like distortions and deletions that she was including in her speech. So I felt, and I still stand by this, that final consonant deletion was the most important thing to target with this client. And I'm glad I did so. Then I also decided to target S, SH, and Z. And the reason why I chose these three is because the client was using them interchangeably, which was a little bit odd to me. So she was able to say each of them, like she was physically able to produce it. But for some reason, she would just kind of pick one of the three whenever that sound was supposed to be in a word. And it was kind of odd. And so at the time, I was like, oh, that's kind of odd. I've never seen that before. I think I'm just going to work on differentiating these. And it worked, and she did very well with it. But in retrospect, this wasn't an ideal target. The reason why is because S, SH, and Z don't really generalize to other sounds. And so if I was going to treat this client all over again or a similar client, I instead would have chosen a cluster such as SL or SHR. The reasoning why is because then she could work on the S sound and the SH sound, but when combining it with the L and the R, it's going to make it more complex, which means it's going to generalize to even more. And maybe she could have improved her R production over time. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold today. Improved her art production over time, which, as I mentioned before, she had trouble with, and she was using cluster reduction, which, while normal at her age, that is something that maybe she could have benefited from. So if I was going to do it again, I would have done a cluster instead of differentiating between these three sounds. The other thing that I decided to target was ja. The reason why I chose ja is because it's a sound that is a complex target and will likely generalize to other speech sounds. She did not have ja in her inventory, and so that was kind of where I put the complexity theory into play. But again, if I was going to do this again, I maybe would keep ja because we ended up having a lot of fun treating that sound, and I do think it ended up helping. But I also would have included a cluster such as SL or SHR. Okay, so how did I write the goals? So let's go back. You can see that there was 3 things I decided to target: final consonant deletion, differentiating between S, SH, and Z, and pronouncing ja. The way that I wrote the goal is as follows. By the end of the semester, clients will repress final consonant deletion at the sentence level with 1 or less prompts per trial in 8 out of 10 opportunities or greater as measured by clinician data log. I think this is an okay goal. I think it could have been written a lot better. I think that I would give it a little bit more specificity. So how is she repressing it at the sentence level? Is it through a narrative? Is it through play? Through picture cards? We did a lot of picture cards. Again, I would say instead of 1 or less prompts, I would say 1 or fewer prompts or no more than 1 prompt. Per trial, I think is fine. I also don't like 8 out of 10 opportunities or greater. I think I might reword that just to make it a little bit less confusing. The second one is going to be written pretty much the same because I wrote these all in the same semester, obviously. I was in the same stage of learning. So the second goal was by end of the semester, client will accurately produce SZSH in all positions of words at the word level with 2 or less prompts per trial and at least 8 out of 10 opportunities as measured by clinician data logs. And then the third one was by the end of the semester, client will produce ja in the initial position of words at the word level in 7 out of 10 opportunities or greater as measured by clinician data logs with 2 or less verbal prompts per trial. So I want to point out a couple of different things on this slide. So the first one is, I want you to look here. So in this goal, I wrote brackets, or they're not brackets, backslashes, I guess. That signifies that whatever is inside of them is a phoneme, okay? So S, Z, and this shape is called an esh. It stands for SH, right? It's the phonological symbol. And so because all of those are true phonemes, they're in these backslashes. Here, I wrote ja in parentheses. The reason why I did that is because I just did. If I was going to rewrite this, I would go to a phonological keyboard and just get the ja symbol, just because that makes it a lot more uniform to have it the same way. But because it is not the true phonological symbol, you'll see that I have it in quotation marks. So if I would have chosen to do SH instead of using the esh symbol, I would have had to put SH in quotation marks instead of in these brackets. So I just wanted to make that clear, first of all. The second thing I want to talk about is the difference in accuracy production. So in these first two, I chose 8 out of 10, and in the last one, I chose 7 out of 10. And why? The reason why is because the first two goals are things that she should already be doing by her age. The third goal is something that she doesn't necessarily isn't necessarily expected to do by her age. So we didn't need 80% accuracy. Also, her beginning accuracy was so much lower. I can't remember exactly what it was, and I might have it on the next slide, but I want to say it was lower than 40%. And so we wanted to make it a realistic goal. That's part of a SMART goal, is making something that's realistic. And for her, it just wasn't realistic for her to have 80% accuracy at the time. And I think at the end of the semester, she did end up reaching 80% accuracy, which is fine. It's great if your client goes over, but you want to set them up to succeed, not to fail. And so for this client, that's why we chose that. The last thing that I wanted to point out is here we have 2 or less verbal prompts per trial at the end. So you can see here that it's the same information, it's just written in a different way. So in this goal, it's in all position of words, blah, 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 with 2 or less prompts per trial in this, da, da, da. And then here it's the other way around. And that just kind of goes by preference. A lot of SLPs prefer to just include by clinician data log at the end of the goal. I'm not sure why. That's just typically how goals are written. And I think that's fine, but I also think it's fine if you write it this way, because you're still getting the same information in there. So hopefully that helps you see how I assessed the client, used the milestones to see what she needed to work on, thought through, okay, these are the 3 things I'm going to target, and then wrote them into a goal based on her performance during the assessment and the milestones. And then once I have those goals, I decide how to treat them. So the first one is we did a lot of differentiation. So I had those cute picture cards. I think I showed them a couple weeks ago. The lesson picks cards, I love them. And so I would print those out, and I would have one of a cow and one of a couch. And I would have one of a little girl, and we would always talk about this little girl being named Sue. So she knew that the little girl was named Sue, and one of a zoo. One of a different little girl, which was, or it was a boy and a girl, and there was an arrow pointing at the girl. And so that one was she. And then we had a picture of the ocean, and that one was sea. And so there were lots of different minimal pairs like that. And we would flip them over and shuffle them up, and we would do like a matching game where she would flip it over and have to say what the word was. We would also do a game like Go Fish, where she would be like, do you have a cow? And I would give her a cow, and then she'd be like, I didn't want this. And I would be like, well, you asked for it. And so by doing that, she was able to learn, like, oh, if I don't pronounce the last sound of the word, it changes the meaning. We would also do a lot of like silly games, where like I would purposefully mess up the word. Like I would say, oh, I was talking to my best friend Zoo, and she told me, and then the little girl client would say, whoa, 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 your best friend isn't named Zoo. That's where the animals live. So we would do like silly games like that. We would also do straight up drill games where I would give her a word, she would say it, and we would do like 5 or 10 in a row. And then she could play with a game. We also did a lot of crafts. So I would give her like at the beginning of the semester, like a 1-to-1 craft piece. So she would answer a word, I would give her a craft piece. She would answer a word, I would give her a craft piece. And once she had all the craft pieces, then she would answer a word, she could glue the craft piece, answer the word, she could glue the craft piece. And then by the end of the session, we had only done one craft. It didn't take a lot of planning on my part. I just had to like cut out, different eyeballs for a pumpkin and like a little pumpkin guy. And she got like an eyeball, nose, mouth, pumpkin and then glued it all. And that was like the whole activity for the whole day. And it kept her entertained the whole time, even though we were just drilling picture cards, because it was something she was into. She loved crafts. And then towards the end of the semester, I would, instead of doing like a 1-to-1, I would do like, okay, you have to do 3 in order to get a craft piece, or you have to do 5 to get a craft piece. And so that was really motivating for her because she wanted the craft pieces. So she would do it as quickly and as accurately as possible. Um, and this child was very motivated to improve her intelligibility. I think I mentioned last week, she was aware that people didn't understand her. It was very frustrating for her. And so, one thing that I did, that I would not do for all clients, but for this client felt it was appropriate, is I would put her cards by accuracy. So if she was accurate with one card, I would put it on the left. And if she was wrong with a card, I would put it on the right. And so she was able to also get that visual feedback of, okay, I did that correctly or I did that incorrectly. And anytime she did something incorrectly, I would give her very specific feedback of, okay, I heard you say this, you needed to say this. In order to fix it, you have to move your tongue this way. For S or SH, it was forward or back. For Z or S, it would be buzzing or not buzzing. And that was very helpful for her to hear that very specific feedback of what she needed to do in order to improve. So she was able to hear that feedback and also see the feedback in front of her of, these are the ones I'm doing well on, these are the ones I need to fix. And again, she was an odd child, like no other little preschoolers like that for the most part. But also she really enjoyed movement activities. So like I mentioned earlier, we were working on Ja. And so for those, I made a spinner card, like a, like Candyland or whatever. Candyland doesn't have one, Life, where you like spin it and whatever it landed on, she would have to say that word 5 times and then do the action 5 times. And they were like jump, jog, jig, jumping jacks, and words like that, that all started with the ja sound, but it was also an action. And so she loved it because it gave her an excuse to get out of her chair, run around, move. And it was silly, but she also was pronouncing that ja sound a lot of times. And so I was able to get really great data for that, because she was very highly motivated by knowing she was about to have a movement break afterwards. Also, I would start with maximal cues and very specific feedback, and then I would back off once she started understanding the differentiation. So again, at the beginning of the semester, like I said earlier, I would literally just put a cow and a couch in front of her, and I would like tell her to pick up one, and she would pick it up. And then I would have her do the same for me. And we just worked until she was able to hear the difference. And then once she understood that there was a difference, then we started to back off my support a little bit, and work on her accuracy. And also, I skipped a point here because I wanted to go back to it. But one way that I backed off was, instead of giving her very specific verbal and tactile cues, is I started giving her a visual cue. So she learned that the S was a snake. And so that was her snake sound. SH was shh, the quiet lady sound. And then the B sound, I can't remember the hand motion I had for it, but I did have also picture cards that I would just point to sometimes. And the B sound was a buzzing sound. And so if she was saying an S instead of a Z, I would like point to the little B card, and I wouldn't even have to say anything, but just seeing that cue, she would fix her production. And then for the final consonant deletion, we had a stop because she didn't stop her word, and she needed to stop the word instead because she didn't include the last sound. And so those were a couple of visual cues that really benefited her in treating her goals. And so if we go back a little bit, you can see that all of those activities work towards going to her goals. So final consonant deletion at the sentence level, we would play a game, like a matching game, and she would have to put it into a sentence. And if she messed up, I would say this. And as the semester went on, I gave her less prompting because her goal is written with one or less prompts per trial. So if I gave her 10 cards and did that, I can only give her one prompt in all 10 of those cards in order for her to meet this goal. Same thing for the other two goals. We provided more support at the end, and then we tried to make it so that we could pull off our support and make her more independent. And so that client, as we talked about a little bit last week, ended up graduating from speech and is off in elementary school, killing it now. All right, so let's walk through the language goals. So another client that I had was school aged. So client two is a school aged child with ASD. ASD means autism spectrum disorder. So she had autism. When she was 4, she had not said a word yet, not said her first word. She communicated only with very basic signs, like more and grunts. When the time I saw her in clinic, she was in elementary school already. She had a vocabulary of about 20 to 30 words, which usually in elementary school, you have several thousand. She had an AAC device, and she did not use it consistently at home. She did use it at school, but because it wasn't used at home, it wasn't charged at home. And so often it came to sessions dead. She had a variety of behavioral problems, very low vocabulary, very low MLU, poor pragmatic skills, meaning the social use of language, like eye contact, maintaining conversational topics, taking turns with conversation, replying when somebody asks you a question. And her mother also had some speech sound production concerns, but due to the severity of her language deficit, that wasn't really an area of primary concern for us. As I said with the last client, what you say is a lot more important than how you say it. And so if you have a typically developing child who has no language concerns at all, but is mispronouncing some things, then yeah, focus on the speech sounds. But for this client, I can't remember her exact age and I don't want to reveal it anyway, just for her confidentiality. But she was in elementary school and she only had 20 words, which is typically what kids have at age like 2. And she had an AAC device that she wasn't really using, lots of behavioral concerns. So we felt like it was way more important to target her vocabulary and give her a way to communicate her wants and needs than to focus on how she's pronouncing the words that she does have. So we decided to expand her utterance length. So at the beginning of the semester, she was only saying one word at a time, sometimes 2 words in frozen phrases like go away, open door. The second one was vocabulary expansion and speech sound production. So to reiterate, speech sound production was not the primary goal, but it was informally targeted, which I mentioned last week, that sometimes if there's something that like a parent wants, there's a way that you can sneak it in to go along with a real target, a real goal, but it's not something that you really take data on or focus on, but it's something that can maybe kind of benefit alongside the main goal. So in this case, the speech sound production was kind of targeted when we worked on vocabulary expansion. And so we would use those Kaufman cards that I talked about last week, and we would pull CVCV vocab words like baby or dino. And the goal was to expand her spoken vocabulary, but also train her to find new and novel words on her AAC device. So we would give her the word, try to have her say it a couple of times. Sometimes she would, sometimes she wouldn't. And then we would grab her AAC device and help her navigate, usually by actually like going with her, like holding her hand and doing it with her. Or once she had learned where the word was, like Play-Doh, she loved Play-Doh and she learned where to find it in her AAC device. That was kind of what we were working on as well. And then finally was completing sentence closes with both verbal language and using her AAC. This was to increase both her receptive and expressive vocabulary. It was also to model longer sentence frames since she was only saying 1 or 2 words at a time. By us giving that example of a long sentence, we felt that it would be beneficial as a language facilitation strategy for her. And then finally, we informally worked on naming things in categories. Um, so, for example, which again was helpful for using the AAC. So, for example, we would give her a sentence such as, like, maybe we were working with Mr. Potato Head and we wanted to work on the category of body parts. And so we would give her just the potato, and then we would have a couple of different items. I'll get into this later, actually, on another slide of how we targeted it. But now that I started, I'll just keep going. So we would have a couple of different body parts, like a tongue and a hand. And I would say, you taste with your, and she could see the two options of tongue or hand. She would have to hear, taste, and pair it with the correct body part. But we didn't want to just leave it as like an open-ended question of you taste with your and have her try to think through every possible body part. So that's why we gave her the two options. And most of the time she would select the right one for body parts, at least. She would select the tongue and she would say tongue, or um, we would have her navigate to it in her AAC device, and then we would put the tongue in the potato and then do another one with like a hat and a hand. And so that was just a way to work on her expressive vocabulary because she would have to say the word, informally target on categories because we're talking about all of the same things in the same context, which helps her group them together. And then also work on her receptive vocabulary because she would have to hear the sentence, hear taste, right? And pair that with with word finding, and then also again with the longer sentence frames. So to summarize, long story short, we chose 3 things: expanding her utterance length, expanding her vocabulary, and completing sentences. How did we write these goals? So the first one was, by the end of the semester, clients will produce 3-word phrases. So remember, she had 1 and a couple of 2-word phrases. So we wanted to get her up to 3. Um, and verbal, gestural, or AAC, we specified because, again, we didn't care how she said it. We just cared that she did say it. To request, protest, or comment when provided no more than 2 prompts, visual and phonemic, with 80% accuracy over 3 consecutive sessions as measured by the clinicians. Clinicians, because there were 2 of us. The visual and phonemic cues. So visual would be similar to what I was saying for the last client, pointing at a picture card. We sometimes would take her hand, like I mentioned, and actually point to the cards or point to the AAC button with her, but also phonemic cues. We would start the word for her, as you saw with Dr. Kaufman last week when she was working with that little boy on expanding his sentences. We would say like, G, and then they would have children go. Or we did a lot of, she loved animals. So we would do a lot of like playing with farm animals with a farm set. So we would say like the whole, and we wouldn't finish, but she would have to use her context clues and the phonemic cue of huh to understand that we wanted her to say horse. And so we would say like, the horse jumps. And so we would sometimes have picture cards, we would use phonemic cues, we would have her point, we would point, and just do everything we could to try and get her to have longer phrases. The next goal is she will independently produce a variety of CVCV words with 80% accuracy over 3 consecutive sessions as measured by clinicians. So you see here that there is independently written in here. There's no prompting involved with this goal, which is awful. We should not have written it this way. We thought based on her prior progress that this would be a good goal for her and one that she could do independently. But by the end of the semester, we realized it just wasn't going to happen. And so if I was going to rewrite this goal, I would give her, not just us, but her a little bit more leniency there. Give her at least one prompt, because it's just not fair to have to set your expectations so high that a client can't meet them. You want to make sure that the goals you're writing are realistic. And so she, again, let's see what else I wanted to point out in there. Oh yeah, over the 3 consecutive sessions, I did include that in this goal. I didn't for the other client I was talking about. And if I was going to rewrite these goals again, all of this stuff that was in parentheses, sorry, I'm jumping around so much today. I had too much coffee, I guess. All these things that are in parentheses, I would put in E dot G dot comma, or an I dot E dot comma. EG means for example, IE means exactly. So for here, I would use EG for both because we wanted to take any kind of communication. So just for example, verbal, gestural, or with AAC, but we would take anything. If she wrote a word, we would take it. So anything. And then here, no more than 2 prompts, I also would say EG because we didn't just give her visual and phonemic, we also gave her tactile and auditory. So if I wrote IE, that means that anytime we used a tactile cue, she wouldn't meet her goal. So that's why I would use EG for both of those. If, for example, you were only going to take verbal or AAC or signed phrases, so say, for example, she didn't have an AAC device, say she was just verbal and signing, you could specify like IE verbal comma ASL, verbal comma manual sign. So it just depends on the exact client and what you're wanting them to do. For this specific client, we would take anything. So that is how I would write the goal, is to take anything. And for long-term goal 2, I also would include more prompting. And for the variety of CVCV words, I would provide an example, and maybe even a definitive list, because we really only used a few different words. I want to say no more than 15. So I maybe would include an example with a list below later in the report of what exact words we were targeting. But I think otherwise that's fine. I also would specify for CVCV exactly what kind of CVCV there is. So there's a couple different ways that words can be CVCV. It could be the same consonant and the same vowels. It could be the same consonant, different vowels, different consonant, same vowels, or different, 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 different. And that is a big difference between those things. Saying Baba is a lot harder or is a lot easier than saying dino, because Baba is reduplicated. It's the same consonant and the same vowel repeated, versus dino. Those are all different consonant and vowels. That's going to be harder to produce. And so I know for a fact that this client was working on C1, V1, C2, V2, which is the dino words. So I'm curious why I didn't include that in this goal when it was written. And if I was going to write it again, I would specify what kind of word shape we were working with. Long-term goal. By the end of the semester, the client will complete a variety of close phrases. So that could be body parts, household items, etc. Again, I hate the way that that's written. I would make that an EG comma, and I would never include the etc. at the end at this point in my career. Verbally, so here we did specify verbally. when given a function example, so here we go, e.g., you hear with your ears, I would put a comma after that period, um, after the second period, I mean. I would also put that in quotation marks, and I would put it in two different quotation marks. So you hear with your, I would have in one set, and ears, I would have in another set. And a field of two objects, ears and mouth, again, I would put example there, e.g., with 80% accuracy over 3 consecutive sessions as measured by clinicians. Um, so again, just some my own critique. I promised this during the intro video that I would tear myself apart for your benefit so you can learn from my mistakes. Because even these goals that I've written in the past couple of years, I now would not write them this way. And that just shows that the more you practice, the better you're going to get and the more comfortable you're going to get. And also, reviewing your own goals is the best way to improve because you'll be able to spot your own mistakes and think, oh, right, like I'm not going to do that again. Like I know I always learn best from my own mistakes. And so for these three goals, while I love what we decided to target, I think what we decided to target was excellent for this client. I definitely would have written these goals differently, especially with some of just the nuanced, like grammatical things, like the parentheses, how the example and IE things are written, I would fix, which I mentioned for all of the goals. For the second goal, again, I wouldn't write it as independently, and I would just be a little bit more clear with a couple of the things which I've mentioned throughout this slide. So I hope that helped a little bit. We're going to talk about how we targeted them. So I've kind of touched on this a little bit throughout, so I'm going to go quickly through this slide. But in order to expand her phrases, we would give her an activity that she really enjoyed. That's called a preferred activity. And we would require her to use a specific number of words before she got what she wanted. So, for example, we would have like a puzzle, and she would only get a puzzle piece if she asked for it with 2 or 3 words, depending on what we were working on that day. Same thing for like Play Doh. We would close the Play Doh, and she was unable to open it without help. And so, until she said, like, open red Play Doh, we wouldn't open it. And so we also provided picture cards to help her think of the words. So we did have those picture cards available laid out in front of her. My AirPods just died, so hopefully the audio doesn't get too bad. So we'd have those laid out in front of her, and she would have wasn't able to verbally. And if she was having trouble even doing that. As we mentioned before, she had quite a bit of behavioral problems. We would take her hand and point for her, just to reiterate that she did have to do something, even if she was refusing to talk that day. It just demonstrated to her that speech is a time where you need to participate. And so we ended up doing that gently, of course, gently. And we would also use both verbal language and her AAC to target this, even though the goal, I believe, was written. Oh no, this goal was written for both. And then playful obstruction and purposeful withholding, we would also do. So sometimes we would give her like a little snack, but we'd only give her like 1 goldfish, and she wanted 12. And so we would have like a whole little cup of goldfish, and she would just get 1 or 2, and she would look at us like, you guys are crazy. But then that motivated her to ask for more goldfish. So open goldfish, or I want goldfish, and that was helpful. We also did playful obstruction. So having her favorite toy inside of like a Tupperware, like a clear Tupperware container, and she couldn't get the top off, and she would have to ask us to open the toy in order to be able to play with it. So that was one thing that we did quite a bit, along with the phonemic cueing, of course. To produce the CVCV words, we would use Kaufman cards and reward her for stickers every time she produced a word. And then for the categories and sentence closes, we would use, for example, like a Mr. Potato Head to build him. We used a farm set sometimes, like
an animal that moos is and she would say cow. All right, so now that we've gone through a couple of my previous clients, how I walked through assessing them, looking at the milestones, deciding what to target based on their assessment and milestones and history, and then taking those things that I decide to target and turning them into goals, and then eventually treating them. Let's do one together of somebody who we both don't know. Okay, so this is a two-parter. So what I'm going to have you do is I, of course, already watched this and I wrote down my observations and data here. I'm going to link the two videos below. Go ahead and watch those and take your own data and then come back to this and go ahead and look at my data and we'll talk through what we noticed for our observations and data. I'll go ahead and pause the recording or actually no, y'all can just pause me. Okay, great, welcome back. I hope you watched the two parts of the video. So a couple of observations and data points that I took was that the child put story cards in the correct order independently, but then she second guessed herself and she needed moderate prompting to go back to the correct answer that she originally had in the first place. That tells me that she kind of knows what's going on, but she's not confident in herself. The second one is that she was able to identify both mommy and cake. The third one is that she independently states an initiating event with appropriate grammar. That means that whatever started the whole everything, in this case, it was going to the party. She was able to use that with appropriate story grammar. She gave short descriptions using and then as a starting phrase for each after the initiating event. So, for example, she would say, well, he went to the door and then they sat down and then they got a cake and then they ate it. Right. And so she was using and then as a starting phrase for every single thing after her initial event. She did not include any internal events, complex vocabulary, or complex sentences. Internal events are like thoughts and emotions that you don't see, but you can infer. So if somebody's smiling, they might be happy, they might be thinking about something funny. And complex vocabulary, of course, is just a vocabulary word that's a little bit harder than happy. So if she was only saying happy, that might be concerning versus if she was saying stuff like excited. That shows a little bit more complexity in her vocabulary. And then finally, she didn't have any complex sentences, right? She was just saying, and then they sat, and then they ate cake. And so she didn't use any conjunctions or negations or questions. And so that's something that this child could improve upon. One thing that I noticed that she did great is she answered all WH questions accurately and appropriately. She made inferences with prompting, but not all of them were appropriate. So the clinician asked her, why the birthday cake was there or what present she bought for him. And she said, oh, she brought a birthday cake for a present. But then the clinician was like, did she? And then the girl corrected to, oh, it was a toy train. So she just needed minimal prompting. So she could make inferences. Not all of them were great, but with a little bit of help, she got it. And so that's something that you might either want to formally target or informally target. And then we noted on the second read through, so this was a great example of dynamic testing, right? Where she tested her and then she taught her and then she retested, because at first she just gave her the picture cards, asked her to put them in order, which she did and then didn't and then did again. And then the clinician had her tell the story the way that she wanted to. And then the clinician gave her a model and she was like, okay, my turn. I'm going to tell the story. And so she told a much more complex, detailed story with internal states, initiating events, action events, a conclusion. Um, and then she had the child do it again, and the child did it again with a little bit more vocabulary, a little bit more complex sentences, but it still didn't include any internal states. And so that's something that I think could definitely be targeted. Um, Hopefully, you guys had similar data and observations to these two videos. So next what we're going to do is we're going to identify strengths and weaknesses. So go through all of your data and think about it. Okay, what did I write down that she did well? What did I write down that she did okay at? What did I write down that she just totally bombed? And so we can look here that her strengths are answering WH questions, making inferences, and identifying characters and clear actions, right? So she was able to answer all the WH questions. A lot of the time she made appropriate inferences, not all the time, but she is kind of young. And then the third one is identifying the characters and the clear actions. She knew who was in the story and what they were doing based on what she saw, but wasn't taking that next step. So some of the girls' areas of improvement are including internal states, so things that the characters may not or may be thinking or feeling that aren't explicitly laid out in the pictures, using appropriate narrative language such as first, second, then, last, after, instead of just saying and then and then and then and then and then. And then finally is putting the pictures into the correct order independently, which she did and then didn't and then did. So this is something that you might focus on informally and just have her do it before you start therapy each time, but not necessarily something you would write a goal for, just something that you would do in addition to the treatment. So let's go ahead and put these into a goal. So for the sake of this goal, I decided that she's going to start therapy now, and she's going to be done at the end of the school year, May 2021. Her name is Amanda, totally made up. And I'm going to think of a couple of areas of improvement based on her areas of improvement that we laid out here. So we need one for including the internal states and one for using appropriate narrative language. So for this one, I copy pasted it right here, right? Retell a story using narrative language. Example, this is the correct way to write it, by the way. First, next, then, last. And internal states, example, thinks, feels, knows. The reason why I wrote down thinks, feels, knows is because those are appropriate words that a child can use in order to identify internal states. And obviously, you're not going to ask the child, what is their internal state? Because they're going to be very confused. And so you could ask, like, what are you thinking? And the child then would be like, oh, she thinks this. And so that's why I wrote it as thinks, feels, knows. And then, so we have the date, we have her name, we have 2 areas of improvement, and then we need to think about what circumstances we're going to do this. So I said because she was assessed this way that I would give her 4 to 6 narrative picture cards. That doesn't mean that you have to only use narrative picture cards in therapy every week. It just means that she has to do it with 4 to 6 narrative picture cards in order to meet her goal, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. But I think that that was a clear context and a clear way for her to meet her goal that you can take data on. The next one is what kind of prompting are you going to give her? I said she could have no more than 2 prompts, for example, visual or verbal. And then when will she meet the goal? When she includes 3 internal states and begins each transition with appropriate narrative language. So there's 2 meets here, right? So the first one is when she includes 3 internal states, which goes along with this goal. The second one is begins each transition with appropriate narrative language. That goes along with the first one. And you guys might have slightly different goals than me. So you guys might have chosen a different circumstance. Instead of using 4 to 6 narrative picture cards, maybe you used 6 to 8. Maybe you decided to use a wordless storybook or a story retell or watching a video. Here we go for prompting. Again, you could have something different. You could have one prompt or no prompts. I probably wouldn't write it as no prompts, but I could see only one prompt because she did an okay job during her assessment. And she does have quite a bit of time before the end of the year. And then meeting the goals, again, that's just kind of arbitrary, right? When she includes 3 internal states, that could be 4. When she begins each transition with appropriate narrative language, you could write, instead of that, you could say begins at least 80% of all transitions with appropriate language. So here, that this is implying that 100% of her transitions have to have a narrative word attached to it, like first, next, then, last. You could write it as in with appropriate narrative language in 80% of transitions, meaning that for 1 or 2 of them, she could not have a transition word, but she would need one for the rest of them. The reason why I have it written out this way is because we're using the narrative picture cards. So that gives a clear cut thing of, okay, Amanda, like you need to have a transition every time you do a new card. But if you were going to do something different, like a wordless storybook or a wordless Pixar clip, then maybe you don't need a transition and that might be harder to measure too. So that's also why I chose the narrative picture cards with this goal, because it's a lot easier to measure. It's less arbitrary, right? Okay. So then what I did is I literally copy pasted this into this. And I wrote them in 2 different ways just to show you guys that it can be mixed up and still include all of the information. So here I have, by May 2021, given 4 to 6 narrative picture cards and no more than 2 prompts, example, verbal, visual, Amanda will retell a story using narrative language, example, first, next, then last, for every transition between cards over 3 consecutive sessions as measured by clinician data. I think that's a pretty good goal, right? It's very clear, it's realistic, it has the date, her name, the context, the task, the prompting, everything that you need included. And all we had to do was, take some data, divide the data into areas of strengths and weaknesses, and then put it down into this goal outline of the date, name, area of improvement, under what circumstances, what prompting, and when is she going to meet the goal. And then you can just copy paste that straight into one organized goal. And I think that looks like a really good one. So hopefully these slides will help you understand how to walk through this. This is going to be your project this week, is doing something very similar of watching a video, taking data, writing a goal, writing a lesson plan based on the goals. And so I hope that this is helping. The second goal, I did the same exact way. I just wrote it in a slightly different way to show that you can organize it in a different way as long as it includes all the information. So you can see here, her name is in both of them. This is in both of them, the green, the blue, the yellow, the purple. And you can see here, the purple is split up. That's what she needs in order to meet the goal. So it doesn't all have to be chunked together the same way every time. So here, by May 2021, Amanda will include 3 or more internal states, example, thinks, feels, knows, when retelling a story, when given, see, I would rewrite this right here. This is me critiquing a goal that I just wrote. I would say, while retelling a story, when given 4 to 6 picture cards and no more than 2 prompts, example, verbal, visual, over 3 consecutive sessions as measured by clinician data. The reason why I would change that word here is just because having when right next to each other is just a little much for me. But honestly, all goals are kind of wordy just because they have to be in order to include all of the information. So sometimes there's just no way around having a pretty wordy goal. Hopefully that helped. Um, and then here we're going to walk through how to target these goals that we just wrote. So one, because both of these goals are about narrative language and include picture cards specifically, you are going to need to provide narrative cards every time you measure data for the goal. I said that at the beginning. So anytime that you're taking data for her progress report or her goal or whatever, again, this is over 3 consecutive sessions. So for the last 3, before you have her conference, you have to provide narrative cards for that or else it won't count. But just because they're written that way, you don't have to have picture cards every time, right? So you can use those short stories or video clips in order to teach the skills, especially towards the beginning of the semester. So maybe at the beginning of the semester, you have, again, I write right here, have part of the session be explicitly teaching narrative language and or internal states. So maybe you have like a little graphic organizer that has like first, next, then last, like at the top, and then identifying things as they happen together while you watch like a little like a 1-minute Pixar clip, and then have her do it a little bit more on her own, and then you give her feedback. Maybe you can do that towards the beginning. You could also work with like a Disney story that she knows really well, like Cinderella, most kids know, or I'm trying to think, like Frozen, most kids know. And so you can be like, okay, what happens first in Frozen? Like, Elsa becomes the queen, right? And then Elsa's powers go crazy. And next, Anna has to go find Elsa. After that, Anna gets frozen. Finally, Elsa saves Anna. The end. And so by breaking apart something very familiar to them, they can practice using that kind of language, which they might not have had experience with before. You can also use internal states by using like thought bubbles above characters. So you could print out a picture of the clip and be like, okay, right here. And you can have like a little laminated thought bubble and put it right on their head and be like, what is this person thinking right now? And the client would have to infer what they're thinking. You could do lots of stuff. This is a fun goal, like honestly. um, yeah, using a graphic. I'm trying to look through my notes now. I've just been kind of talking. Practice asking what characters might be thinking or feeling. Yeah, do that throughout the clip, throughout the story. Like point out facial expressions. Use those car questions, right? Relate it back to them. Like, oh my gosh, have you ever stubbed your toe? Wow, that must hurt. What do you think that this person's feeling? How have you felt when you stubbed your toe? And then finally, once she has the skills down, really start taking data with the picture cards, especially as you reach the end of her goal to get sufficient data for her IEP. So the way that I would organize this is now, since we're pretending like this goal starts today and ends at the end of May. And again, I would put this specific date her IEP. So let's say her IEP is May 21st. And so I would start the semester by talking about story grammar with the graphic organizer. As I said earlier, I would spend like one session doing that. The next week, I would review that. After that, I would do practicing what characters are thinking or feeling for most of the session, and then a really quick review of the graphic organizer. And then again, practice what characters are thinking or feeling. So that's like 4 weeks right there of just teaching her what to do. And then at that point, once I've really explicitly taught her this and we've had a few weeks of practice, then I would do narrative picture cards to get data on how she's doing with that. And then that brings us all the way to April. Now she has 1 month left. And then I would practice like actually doing that with less cueing, especially making sure that for the last 3 weeks, so pretty much all of May, you're using the graphic organizer for at least once per session so that you can get the data to prove that she is good to go. And again, I would use the graphic organizer more than the last 3 weeks. The reasoning being if she, because the goal is written for the 3 consecutive sessions, um, if she doesn't do it on the last session, then that kind of sucks, right? So you want to make sure that you give her the time in case she messes up one of the weeks. So I would maybe have like quite a few of these included towards the end, maybe for the last like 6 sessions or so, just in case. And to give her practice, because if she's been doing the whole semester just videos and books, then she might not understand the graphic organizer. So I think that maybe for like the first half, I would start off with just teaching and doing fun stuff, and then I would use the graphic organizer for the rest of the time. But I wouldn't make that the entire session. I would have it just be part of a session with some teaching and feedback included, and some fun activities that she enjoys as well, just to make sure that speech is motivating, and to make sure that she wants to come back. Okay, that was a lot. I know the last couple of weeks have been long. It was planned this way in the syllabus. These 2 weeks are going to be the longest 2 weeks because we were watching these videos together. I wanted to really deep dive into my thought process when I'm taking data and moving from data to goal writing and reading. Um, and also, just to reiterate that it's okay if you don't feel confident and if you think your goals are horrible, because we've all been there. Even I, like sitting here, I'm reading these, like, wow, that was an awful goal. Like, I wish I hadn't wrote that. I'm embarrassed that like there's a legal document out there that I have signed that I wrote this goal for. And really, the only way to improve is to practice. Practice writing, practice reading, give yourself and your peers feedback, read other people's goals, have other people read your goals and give you feedback. And I'm going to be including a goal bank this week. I do want to say goal banks are great because it gives you a good starting point, but you can't just rely on the goal bank as your entire goal, because you're going to have to tweak things for your individual client. A general goal isn't going to be perfect for anyone. Sorry, I need to wrap this up. And so I'm going to include a goal bank this week for homework. Your homework has 2 parts. Let me get into that first. So the first part is going to be what we just did in this slide. So we're going to be watching a video on Canvas, taking data, creating 2 goals, and then thinking how you would target through those goals, just like we did today. The next thing that I'm going to have you do is look through a goal bank that I'll list on Canvas. And I want you to talk through what you think a student's strengths or weaknesses may be and how you would implement 3 goals. The reasoning why I'm having you do this is because you are in life going to have a child come to you from another school, and you're going to have to be able to implement their goals sometimes without ever meeting them before. And so it can be helpful to look at a goal and be like, okay, based on this, what do I think they might be good at? What do I think they might need help with? Obviously, what the goal is what they need help with. And then discuss, like, hey, how would I treat this goal? Like, what kinds of activities would I do with it? And be creative with it. Like, you heard me, I was brainstorming half the time on this PowerPoint of like, oh, wait, like this sounds like fun. You could watch a movie and then have a graphic organizer. So go ahead and do that too. Just use your imagination. It doesn't have to be perfect. And go ahead and pick 3 goals on the goal bank. It can be anything. Try to pick from different categories so that when you meet and discuss this with your small groups, you're getting ideas from a lot of different goals. And you're also going to be discussing point number 1 with your small groups, to see how your data compares, similar to last week. Like, did you guys have similar thoughts about how the student did? Did you guys write similar goals, or are they different, and how are they different? How is your targeting different? And hopefully between these 2 things, it'll help you understand a deeper level of reading and writing goals, as well as giving you exposure via your peers. But additionally, what I was going to say earlier is when you're writing your 2 goals for point number 1, try not to look at the goal bank. Like, try to do step 1 before you do step 2, because the goal bank isn't perfect. And it's really great practice to write your own goal instead of just taking one from the goal bank, so that you get an idea of ways that you can tweak a goal to your own client. And while goal banks are a great place to start, like I definitely have had instances where I don't really like any of the goals for what I want to target. So definitely keep that in mind in the future. I know this was a long one, as I said before, but you guys are awesome. You're working so hard, and I will see you next week. All right, bye.